Hello, honeys, and welcome to your October Art Historical Special. Today we are covering the deceptions of the Ghost Army. They're described by the Fort Wayne Museum of Art as, quote, the first mobile multimedia tactical deception unit in U.S. Army history, end quote. And even though there is, of course, a broader military history of deception tactics involving creative flair, which these guys in part drew from, they added on to it and discovered ingenious new ways to play the enemy in World War II. We don't typically cover a lot of military intersections with art history on this podcast, but it really was the creative backgrounds of the recruited members of the Ghost Army that made their exploits so successful. And how much more thematic of a title could I ask for than Ghost Army? So, honeys, with a quick reminder that our sources for today include NPR, PBS, BBC, the Ghost Army Legacy Project, the National World War II Museum, the National Veterans Memorial and Monument, and of course, the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, amongst others. Let's learn about how the arts helped the Allies win World War II. Now, as I said, the Ghost Army was based on precedents, on prior ideas. Artists, filmmakers, scientists, and sculptors were handpicked by various militaries and called upon to use their visual and creative skills to design camouflage and decoys during both World Wars. For example, the Army members of both sides used quote-unquote dazzle camouflage and painted their battleships with distracting multicolored patterns during World War I, and a group of surrealist artists started the Industrial Camouflage Research Unit in England just after the war began in September 1939, while concurrently in the US, female art students designed camouflage quote-unquote rock suits that they tested in Van Cortlandt Park in New York. It's unclear what impact either of those efforts really had, however. But, says the National Veterans Memorial and Museum, the Ghost Army's formation was really, quote, inspired by the success of British deception operations and the recognition that psychological warfare could be a powerful tool, end quote, in the early years of World War II. And there's one specific deception operation that's being referred to there that began in the fall of 1940, when Colonel John Turner started building decoy airfields to confuse the Luftwaffe about the scale of Britain's fighter defenses. Turner, who'd retired less than a year earlier, was called back to the office to head a new top-secret department, building fake airfields and lining them with dummy aircraft, an appropriate job for someone who had been the director of works and buildings for the Air Ministry, helping to construct new Royal Air Force airfields in the rapid pre-war mobilization. But the department quickly found that it was too expensive to have the aircraft manufacturers themselves make these dummies. The manufacturers would make them too over-engineered, too complex for simply fooling an overhead passing recon aircraft at 20,000 feet. Then in 1940, Turner meets the Scottish film entrepreneur Norman Loudon, and inspired by the realization of that trade's trick, convinced the Royal Air Force to invest, literally, in the idea of using the film industry's processes to make realistic and cheap sets or dummies. Turner then facilitated the Royal Air Force's commission of Loudon's studios to build 100 dummy airfields and about 400 dummy aircrafts to confuse German aerial bombers. And it worked. Quote, in one raid on August 4th, 1940, 3 waves of bombs struck the decoy structures, leaving the real factory almost unscathed. Turner's sophisticated dummy aircrafts, inner quote, saved hundreds of lives and vital war production facilities, end all quotes. Another specific example is Operation Bertram in North Africa in 1942. That deception used false radio traffic, dummies, camouflage, and more to trick the Axis forces into believing that the Allied attack of the Second Battle of El Alamein would take place to the south and about 2 days later than the real attack did. And now back to the Ghost Army. The division officially and formally known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was the brainchild of Colonel Billy Harris and Lieutenant Colonel, later Major, Ralph Ingersoll. It consisted of 82 officers and about 1,100 men. And I have to say about 1,100 there because our sources provided different totals ranging from 1,082 to 1,200, but most put that number at right about 1,100. Now, Ingersoll was already a celebrity journalist and a best-selling author working as the managing editor of The New Yorker, and who the New York Times once described as a, quote, prodigiously energetic egotist, end quote, while Went Eldridge, a fellow American intelligence officer, said of him, quote, I've never met anyone who was such a bright guy who was such a goddamned liar. He'd say anything to get what he wanted, end quote. Ingersoll joined up and served in North Africa after the war first began, then came home and wrote the best-selling book entitled The battle is the payoff. For his next stint, he was stationed in the quote-unquote Special Plans branch in the Army's headquarters in London for the second half of 1943, working with British planners on various strategic deceptions so that American activities would dovetail with the overall British plan. Ingersoll later claimed that the unit's creation was his sole original contribution to the war effort during World War II. Harris is described by our sources, on the other hand, as a quote-unquote straight arrow West Point graduate with deep military roots. His father was a general, his uncle was a general, his brother became a general, and eventually he did too. His family also had some prestige, as Harris's mother introduced Dwight Eisenhower to his future bride, Mamie Dow. Together, Ingersoll and Harris became the dynamic duo of ideas man and real-life engineering guy. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated on January 20th of 1944 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, under the command of Army veteran Colonel Harry L. Reeder. And Reeder, knowing that the primary goal of this entire unit was to create elaborate illusions that would deceive German forces and therefore protect Allied troops, carefully selected the group of soldiers and focused the recruiting efforts on creative individuals from art schools, advertising agencies, and the entertainment industry. The National World War II Museum writes, quote, many West Point graduates and former Army Specialized Training Program participants were assigned to the 23rd, and it was said to have one of the highest IQs in the Army with an average of 119, end quote. It also featured several individuals who would later become renowned artists or creatives in their own right. The concentration of creative talent contributed significantly to the unit's success, as I said, in crafting convincing battlefield illusions and thus achieving their missions. We'll detour for just a moment to cover some of the most famous of these names. Fashion designer Bill Blass. By the age of 18, he had become the first man to win Mademoiselle's Design for Living Award, and during the war, Blass created dummy tanks, inflatable planes, and artillery pieces in order to deceive the enemies. He began his career in New York fashion and then went on to become a household name after the war. Painter and sculptor Ellsworth Kelly, who's very well known for his color field and minimalism contributions these days. Photographer Art Kane, known for his portraits of Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, The Who, Sonny and Cher, Aretha Franklin, and more. And even investigative reporter Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, who became an officer in the U.S. Army and commanded the Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp in New York, where he oversaw and led the sonic deception units of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. He is also remembered as the man responsible for recruiting Amelia Earhart to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. But like armies do, the 23rd was split into smaller companies within. So if you were in the Ghost Army, these were your potential assignments. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, that was the largest unit in the Ghost Army at 379 men, and they were the visual deception guys, using an array of inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, artillery, jeeps to create deceptive scenes for enemy aerial reconnaissance or even distant observers. They mostly got the job because the unit had spent the previous 2 years doing camouflage work, and it was loaded with artists specially recruited for that job. You then had the Signal Company Special, formerly known as the 244th Signal Company, which was a group of 296 men who had the task of radio deception, aka spoof radio. These operators created phony traffic nets and learned to mimic the styles and tones of specific actual World War II Morse code communicators from various other Army units to impersonate and really sell the illusions that specific units were in this place or the other. This division worked really closely with the 3133rd Signal Service Company, especially to pull off tricks in Italy as well. And of course, then we have the 3133rd Signal Service Company, which was activated June 21st, 1944 at the Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp, New York, so a little bit later, and later joined back up with the rest of the 23rd in Normandy. These approximately 145 men were the main sonic deception unit. Their mission was to play sound effects from powerful speakers mounted on armored vehicles with wheels in the front and tracks in the back, called half tracks, to simulate the sounds of units moving and operating throughout the night. The men of the 3133rd were deployed wherever they were needed after World War II drew to a close and before the unit was disbanded, with some going to the Yugoslavian border and to Greece in 1946. And last but not least, the 406th Engineer Combat Company. These 168 men were trained as fighting soldiers and were really the workhorse guys, providing perimeter security for the rest of the Ghost Army, executing construction and demolition tasks, including digging tank and artillery positions, often using their bulldozers to simulate tank tracks as as part of the visual deceptions. So by the time everything was set, everyone was ready to go and trained, the entirety of the Ghost Army was capable of simulating 2 whole divisions, or approximately 30,000 troops, by using visual, sonic, and radio deception to fool German forces into basically messing up during the final year of World War II. The Ghost Army Legacy Project writes, quote, each deception required that they impersonate a different and vastly larger U.S. unit. Like actors in a repertory theater, they would mount an ever-changing multimedia show tailored to each operation. The men immersed themselves in their roles, end quote. And these tactics, like we kind of hinted at, included deploying rubber inflatable vehicles, planes of all kinds, to create the appearance of a much larger force and therefore mislead enemy leadership. What's so impressive about this story is that even though their work so very much relied on cooperation and collaboration, there are individual examples of soldiers doing pretty big deal work. One such story is that of Lieutenant Dick Syracuse, a transfer to the 3133rd, who trained in recording sounds to simulate large-scale construction projects, including the building of bridges, buildings, and tank movements, to help deceive the Germans into thinking Allies were constructing various structures or moving large amounts of forces. Tasks like that were vital in some of the operations we'll talk about in a little bit. Soldiers who'd previously been actors were frequently put to work around town as plants, posing as this or that Allied official or soldier and quote-unquote giving away information about troop positions, movements, upcoming plans to any enemy spies present in a bar or other public space that they might be hanging out at. So what was life like in the unit? Not surprisingly, these creatives practiced their skills and crafts on the side in their own ways too, creating self-portraits, singing songs, taking photos, and so on. In an interview with Fox 2 St. Louis News posted to YouTube, director Mark Sundlov of the Soldiers Military Museum in St. Louis discussed a German hand grenade case, which was in the museum's possession, and had been found and converted into a traveling watercolor kit by one of the soldiers in the Ghost Army. That little traveling kit is proof that, like most in dire times, these men tried to have at least some good moments when possible. One of our sources for today quotes Ghost Army veteran George Dramis, a native of Ashtabula, Ohio, who was drafted in 1942 at age 18. He, quote, remembers roughing it most of the time, sleeping outside and often lacking adequate supplies, end quote. Dramis said himself in 2022 at age 97, quote, it was just a wild and woolly period of time, but it was very interesting. I could hear fighting all the time, bullets whizzing by, end quote. Though it is right about at this point, honeys, that I feel I need to make an important interruption of myself. The Axis forces absolutely also use dummies and other tricks like this, but we're focusing on the Allied side due to our main story being this particular regiment, the Ghost Army. And now, honeys, the most famous deceptions of the Ghost Army. The Fort Wayne Museum of Art writes, quote, armed with nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns, the 23rd took part in 22 large-scale deceptions in Europe from Normandy to the Rhine River, the bulk of the unit arriving in England in May 1944, shortly before D-Day, end quote. And here's the real kicker about all those operations, honeys, is that part of the Ghost Army's technique was making sure that the enemies knew some Allied troops were there, but in the interest of speed and inciting pursuit, not establishing firm guarded perimeters. So they were pulling off these ruses, setting up and operating fakes and sound systems and all of that, with minimal protection even by the 406, making this among the most dangerous as well as the most creative assignments for an American soldier in World War II. The Ghost Army was assisted at times by the Royal Air Force, who, mostly under the guidance of Colonel John Turner, kept working with Norman Loudon's Shepperton Studios to build low-cost dummies throughout the last few years of the war. Now, we're of course not going to recap all 22 of those missions, but we will highlight a few. First, Operation Fortitude, a massive deception campaign preceding D-Day in summer of 1944. During the mission, the Ghost Army created phantom divisions and drummed up tons of false radio traffic to convince German forces that 300,000 troops were gathering at Kent, Essex, and Suffolk, and that the invasion would actually occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Writes the BBC, quote, by the end of May, a week before D-Day, German intelligence calculated that 79 Allied divisions had assembled in the UK. In fact, the number was only 52, end quote. So while the decisive Western battles were being fought out in Normandy, the German 15th Army, which was more than 150,000 troops, remained at Pas-de-Calais, 200 miles or 321 kilometers kilometers away, prepared for a second major invasion that the German High Command was convinced would happen. Operation Fortitude was an enormous success and a key part of the D-Day win. Next came Operation Brest in August of 1944. This was, according to our sources, the first time that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops used visual, audio, and sonic deception all together at the same time. It was also a learning experience on what not to do, and was one of the rare times that they found themselves smack in the middle of a major battle. A little bit of context is needed to understand what exactly happened here. So, the German troops that were holed up at Brest were determined to fight to the end against 3 American divisions from the 8th Corps, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th, who had encircled the city and were trying to take it because at the time, Brest had become a necessary port for the Allies to be able to supply the growing number of divisions at the Normandy beaches. It was also a bit of a morale thing. General George Patton wrote that General Omar Bradley told him, quote, "We must take Brest in order to maintain the illusion of the fact that the U.S. Army cannot be beaten," end quote, and Patton agreed, writing, quote, "Anytime we put our hand to a job, we must finish it," end quote. So the Ghost Army is called in, and their specific mission is two-part. One, to inflate the perceived size of the American forces attacking the city by pretending to be 2 tank battalions from the 6th Armored Division, which had actually been withdrawn from Brest 2 weeks earlier, as well as a field artillery battalion in order to help convince German General Hermann Bernhard Ramke to surrender. They also aimed to draw German forces towards the flanks and away from the aim of the upcoming planned assault launch, which was the center. 3 task forces for the operation formed after troops arrived on August 21st. Task Force X had the most intricate and arguably the most dramatic role of persuading Axis forces that the 15th Tank Battalion was moving into an attack position threatening the German right flank. They were so convincing, said John Jarvie, a corporal from New Jersey and 22 years old at the time, quote, "We pulled into that area and the other American GIs from other units came running and said, inner quotes, 'Boy, are we happy to see you guys,' end all quotes." The task force obviously pulled off their fake tank movements and deceptive sonic projections, but although they lived through the thick of the battles the next day, they did unfortunately also witness a tragedy. Quote, "Through a miscommunication or a misunderstanding of the deception's impact, Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion joined the attack from near where the Ghost Army had focused the enemy's attention. As a result, they were hit instantly with artillery fire," end quote, "and all inside perished. This was the Ghost Army's lesson in disastrous communication failures and how to avoid them," according to our sources. When Task Force X pulled out that night, their sonic trucks played the sounds of tank departures to maintain the illusions. Despite being similar in size and scope to the work of Task Force X, Task Force Z's 160 men only had a 2-day role instead of 3. Their job was to simulate the 69th Tank Battalion moving into an area on the right flank about a kilometer northeast of Milizac in the northwest corner of France, with support from a company from the actual 709th Tank Battalion, as well as sonic half-tracks from the 603rd. Which brings us to Task Force Y. Their job was to basically draw off counterfire from the real enemy artillery once the battle started on Friday the 25th, and they did that by detonating flash canisters timed with actual fire via wired telephone communications to confuse the enemy on the gunner's actual locations. But these weren't just any flash canisters. According to the Ghost Army Legacy Project, they were homemade with, quote, "spent shells loaded with half a pint of black powder and an electric igniter," end quote. And according to Lieutenant Colonel John Mayo, as well as Corporal Rolf Campbell of the 406th Combat Engineers, this was very effective. The latter wrote some of the shrapnel pieces from the resulting fire on them were, quote, "as big as a man's arm," end quote. Our sources write that even though it's generally agreed the deception was well carried out, it was undermined by the enemy's lack of aerial observation and Ramke's fierce refusal to surrender under any circumstances, so semi-successful. Then in September of 1944 came Operation Bedenberg. Despite being pretty rushed in the planning stages, it became, quote, "the longest deception operation that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted during the war," end quote. During it, they helped defend a dangerously undermanned section of the 3rd Army's front line, stretching more than 20 miles for over a week. The mission of these 500 men from the 23rd was to impersonate elements of the 6th Armored Division to make it seem like reinforcements for this part of the line were much stronger than they were. By pretending to be a company of 8,000 men, they also attempted to draw the enemy away away from Metz. The Ghost Army men moved in, set up their fires, tanks, laundry lines, and so on, learned the history of the units they were impersonating, and quickly stitched up fake uniform patches, painted fake truck markings. They then began running their supply trucks with the frequency required of getting water and more for 8,000 men, started going into town and gossiping about their unit and movements, and so on. The operation was only originally planned to last until the 83rd Infantry Division could arrive to fill that hole, about 2 days, it was expected. But as that ETA stretched out longer and longer as the 83rd was delayed, the soldiers' tensions and fears about discovery rose. As Lieutenant Bob Conrad put it, there was nothing between the Ghost Army and the Germans, quote, but our hopes and prayers, end quote. So if the Germans saw through their tricks, the Ghost Army men were done for. And the Germans may have been able to break through and attack General Patton's Allied forces from behind. Then on September 22nd, the 83rd Infantry was finally prepared to move in to actually hold the line, so the Ghost Army's sonic trucks carefully played the sounds of tanks moving away as the fake 6th Armored Division pulled out in the night and were replaced with the real deal. General Patton's line had held, and after 8 days along the front, the Ghost Army slipped away. And this operation was considered particularly important for the Ghost Army. Its operations officer, Colonel Clifford Simonson, considered it a turning point for the unit and was quoted by our sources as saying, "It was our first operation that was executed fully professionally and correctly," end quote. The Ghost Army were also participants in the Battle of the Bulge occurring in December of 1944, so called, as we know, because it was the last major German push on the Western Front of World War II, their final attempt to split the Allied forces. The unit's deception tactics were again critical in confusing German intelligence about Allied troop movements and their strength, helping to buy valuable time for the actual combat units to regroup and counter the German offensive. Unfortunately, I could not find any more detail than that from our sources, but if you find something yourself, please feel free to DM us the source name. The Ghost Army then pulled off Operation Viersen in late March of 1945, wherein they mimicked the Army's 30th and 79th Divisions by making alternate movements with fake vehicles, fake patches on their fake uniforms, playing recordings of their higher-ups yelling, creating insecure radio communications for spies to listen in on and get fake info, creating smoke screens and using flash canisters, and thus overall distracting the hell out of the Axis forces from the movement of real Allied troops across the Rhine. According to the National Veterans Memorial and Museum, this also ensured a successful operation for the Allied powers who were able to sneak attack from the south afterwards. Another notable mission from April 1945, Operation Craftsman. The operation was a component of the Allied assault on the Gothic Line, Germany's last line of defense in Italy, wherein the 3133rd portrayed the 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, an actual unit equipped with similar M10 vehicles, using faked but accurate bumper markings and signs. And the operation is so impressive and so notable, I think, because it involved multiple parts. In Part 1, the 3133rd was joined by a platoon from the 101st Royal Engineers, a British unit equipped with dummy rubber tanks. The two collaboratively carried out a deception suggesting to the Germans that an armored buildup was happening in the Serchio Valley on the night of April 4th through 5th, directing attention away from the major thrust that would be a few miles away along the coast. Their goal in doing that was to draw fire to reveal the gunner locations of the enemy so that the real Allied forces could take them out. And honeys, imagine your one job is to be the decoy, to be the bait, and get shot at. How? How did they do it? In Part 2, they simulated reinforcements joining the right flank of the American lines as part of the main Craftsman assault near Bologna on April 14th through 15th of 1945 by splitting into 3 sonic platoons, which conducted their operations in 3 different river valleys. The goal of doing that was to freak the enemy out and make them move regiments to the wrong places, which was also successful. But Part 3 was canceled in advance after the German resistance collapsed and fighting finally stopped. And the ending of the war, of course, brings us to what happened after, their legacies, their recognition. Even though the Ghost Army saved thousands of lives and played an important part in the Allied victory in World War II, all of their work was classified until 1996, meaning that, according to the Smithsonian, quote, in total, the 23rd saved the lives of an estimated 15 to 30,000 American servicemen, end quote, but the American public had no idea for the longest time. It also means that even though 3 soldiers were killed on missions and several others were wounded, many were not given Purple Hearts since the records were sealed until the late 90s, simply returning home or continuing on with the military and continuing to keep their stories secret. As for the actual stuff, the equipment that the Ghost Army used to pull off their illusions, according to our sources, it was recycled for use in the Army's aggressor force training program to create a hypothetical enemy for troops practicing combat in the years following. Although none of the inflatable tanks are known to survive today, the techniques pioneered by the unit have had a lasting influence on modern military tactics, and echoes of the designs you see in some of the fake tanks, the camouflage, and so on, used by the Ghost Army, are visible today. But then, honeys, and here's where a really cool personal-ish connection comes in, one student in Iowa decides to do his National History Day project on the Ghost Army and completely blows up the popularity of their story. Caleb Sinwell, a now senior at an Iowa high school, played a pivotal role in getting the Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the living and deceased members of the Ghost Army, and thus attention on their story after his project gained national recognition. As a 9th grader, Sinwell had reached out to author Rick Bayer to interview him for the NHD project on the Ghost Army. Sinwell ended up winning at state to move on to nationals, where his project took first place in the website category, and agreed afterwards to lobby with Bayer for the Congressional Gold Medal for the Ghost Army as part of Bayer's years-long effort urging lawmakers to officially recognize and honor members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Within a year of his win at nationals, Sinwell received a call from Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley in D.C., as well as a senator in Mississippi, both saying that they would sponsor the bill, both then brought on bipartisan co-sponsors. The bill was then signed into law by President Joe Biden in 2022, and the United States Mint worked for 2 years on the design of the custom bronze medal leading up to the Congressional Gold Medal Awards ceremony held March 21, 2024 at the U.S. Capitol. The ceremony honored the 6 known surviving members of the Ghost Army and all of its deceased members as well. So we have a bit of a happy ending for the Ghost Army, honeys, in the sense that eventually their very crucial and very creative work was recognized for the value that it had, for the lives that this ingenuity saved in the midst of wartime. It's also very encouraging to see a child's school project, historical research project, have such a broad and meaningful impact, not only for the people that it is centered on, but for him and his local community. And that, honeys, is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, aka the Ghost Army. I hope you've enjoyed our going outside our usual wheelhouse with this spooky little treat. By the time you hear this, I will be on vacation with family and enjoying the fall weather myself, all the leaves changing and everything. Us gals are also going to an Edgar Allan Poe themed speakeasy event, so I'll make sure to report back on how that goes. But until next time, our next business, honeys, take care, hydrate or dihydrate. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.